Time.
Pennsylvania yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, thanks to Mr. Gerlach and thanks to our very capable staffers for having assembled parts of the argument here, and to point out that in the Senate this was done by unanimous consent. That's an important consideration. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time having been yielded back, the question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 475? Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1151.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1151, a bill to direct the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to obtain observer status for Taiwan at the Triennial International Civil Aviation Organization Assembly and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Faleo Mavenga, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on this legislation.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of bipartisan legislation that I authored to help secure observer status for Taiwan at the International Civil Aviation Organization. This legislation requires the Secretary of State to develop and execute a strategy to ensure that Taiwan has a seat at the table for ICAO's upcoming September meeting. It has been over 40 years since Taiwan was last a member of ICAO, and indeed a lot has changed in that 40 years. As it stands now, all communications between Taiwan and the U.S. on aviation safety must be channeled through the American Institute in Taiwan, which is our nation's de facto embassy in Taiwan. The fact that Taiwan can't speak directly to the Federal Aviation Administration without this added layer of bureaucracy makes no sense. After all, we are talking about air safety information that is otherwise readily available to all of ICAO's members. Taiwan's entry into the U.S. visa waiver program last year has dramatically increased both the frequency of flights between our airports and the real number of travelers coming here to the United States. For my home state of California, the increase in visitors from Taiwan has resulted in a significant boost for the local economy, especially for the travel industry, the leisure industry, restaurants, for example, shops. And I'm proud to have worked on Taiwan's entry into the visa waiver program because I know that as a result of this agreement, Taiwanese Americans in Southern California have a much easier time staying connected to their families. Mr. Speaker, as the number of visitors from Taiwan has grown exponentially, there is an urgent need to ensure that Taiwan has real-time access to air safety information. Strengthening air safety benefits American citizens as much as it does the Taiwanese. Every year, tens of thousands of Americans fly through Taiwan's airspace, which must be as safe as it can be, and this bill will certainly help. Just as Taiwan was allowed to join the World Health Organization as a result of the SARS outbreak, so should Taiwan be afforded the opportunity to observe the proceedings of the ICAO. We all share the responsibility to ensure that international air travel be safe. Taiwan's unique political status has thus far hindered its inclusion in ICAO. With this piece of legislation, we're sending a clear message that air safety is a priority and not a geopolitical issue. Earlier this year, my good friend Elliot Engel of New York and I traveled to Taiwan to see firsthand the immense progress that the people of Taiwan have made over such a short period of time. Taiwan is indeed a beacon of freedom in the Asia-Pacific region. We share many values with Taiwan, including an unwavering commitment to democracy and to human rights and to free markets, to the rule of law. Helping Taiwan gain entry as an observer into the ICAO is the right thing to do, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from American Samoa is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to extend and revise my remarks.
Without objection.
Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 1151, and I yield myself such time as I may constitute.
Gentleman's recognized.
I would certainly like to thank personally the chief sponsor of this proposed bill, our distinguished chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, for his leadership on this issue, and also our senior ranking member, Mr. Elliott from New York, for his support as well. And I'm happy to say that I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill as well. Mr. Speaker, this legislation directs the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to gain observer status for Taiwan at the Triennial Assembly of the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. Taiwan has made significant progress in its economic and political development. Today, Taiwan is a leading trade partner of the United States and stands as a beacon of democracy throughout Asia. However, Taiwan has been shut out of participating in international organizations like ICAO. Founded in 1947, this organization's main goal was to ensure safety and efficiency on air transportation around the globe. Taiwan deserves to be brought into the ICAO as an observer. It has jurisdiction over an airspace of approximately 180,000 square nautical miles and provides air traffic control services to more than 1.2 million flights a year. In my recent visit to Taiwan as well, interesting to learn that there are approximately 600 weekly flights that are now in existence between China and Taiwan alone. Taiwan's international airport is the world's 19th largest in terms of passenger volume, and the number of travelers between Taiwan and the United States is likely to increase with Taiwan's entry into the visa waiver program last year, as mentioned earlier by my distinguished chairman, Mr. Royce. Taiwan's exclusion from ICAO has impeded Taiwan's efforts to maintain the civil aviation practices that keep up with rapidly evolving international standards. It is unable to even contact ICAO for an up-to-date information on aviation standards and norms, nor can it receive ICAO's technical assistance in implementing new regulations or participate in ICAO technical and academic seminars. Taiwan has made every effort to comply with ICAO standards, but their continued exclusion not only hurts Taiwan, but it puts the rest of us in the entire world at risk, especially when you're talking about safety and hazardous conditions when it deals with air travel. With such a heavy volume of flights, Taiwan's exclusion has prevented ICAO from developing a truly global strategy to address security threats based on effective international cooperation. ICAO's own rules and practices allow for the meaningful participation of non-contracting countries as well as other organizations in its meetings and activities through the granting of observer status. The United States, in a review of Taiwan policy conducted in 1994, declared its intention to support Taiwan's participation in appropriate international organizations and has consistently reiterated that support. Mr. Speaker, with this bill today, Congress is calling on the United States government to take a leading role at ICAO to assist Taiwan in gaining observer status, and we look forward to working with our administration officials to track the development of these efforts. Again, I thank the gentleman from California for his leadership in this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from America Samoa, and I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Ross Lehtinen, Chairman Emeritus of the Foreign Affairs Committee and Chairman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. She is also a co-sponsor of this measure.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman of our committee for introducing this excellent piece of legislation and for his leadership in our committee. I am very pleased to speak in favor of this legislation, which assists Taiwan, one of our most valued allies, in obtaining observer status at the ICAO, or the International Civil Aviation Organization. Taiwan is a major hub for international air travel, and particularly it serves as a link between the Northeast and Southeast Asia and to Europe and the United States. And now that Taiwan has joined the Visa Waiver Program, travel between our two nations will undoubtedly increase. Almost 1.3 million flights pass over the region each year. But due to the ill-advised appeasement of China at the United Nations, Taiwan must receive its international aviation safety and security information secondhand. Taiwan's exclusion from international organizations like ICAO is a short-sighted and dangerous practice. It ends up hurting the international community as much as it does the Taiwanese people themselves. Preventing a significant player in aviation like Taiwan from participating in ICAO threatens the entire international community who depend on the application of universal aviation standards. Unfortunately, attempts to placate China at the feeble United Nations are nothing new and a reminder that that organization lacks seriousness. China's threat that foreign interference will hurt negotiations with Taiwan to allow its participation in ICAO should be ignored by the UN. The UN must do what is right for the entire international community, and I urge the organization to put aside its petty politics and work on behalf of the safety of all of the world's citizens. Mr. Speaker, the Taiwan Relations Act continues to be the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy with our democratic ally Taiwan, and we must always keep it as the guiding beacon. The next meeting of ICAO is this September, and I expect to see our State Department have a strategy that they will implement to make sure that Taiwan will be at the table this fall. The friendship between the people of the United States and Taiwan has cemented into one of our most cherished partnerships, and I look forward to the United States government demonstrating its continued commitment to the people of Taiwan with the passage of this most excellent bill. I thank the chairman for the time. I thank him for his leadership on Taiwan through the years, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from America and Samoa is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to associate myself and certainly commend the gentlelady from Florida for her most eloquent statement and historical outline of what has happened in terms of our special relationship with the people and the leaders of Taiwan. And she could not have said it better. You know the old saying, if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu? I think Taiwan has been on the menu for too long. They need to be at the table, and especially playing such a strong and important economic role as a democracy in Asia and as a beacon of light to all the people of Asia, what it means to live under democratic conditions. And with that, Mr. Chairman, again, I thank my good friend, the Chairman, for his leadership in bringing this bill. And I have no further speakers, so I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from America and Samoa yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it has been over 40 years since Taiwan last had a seat at the International Civil Aviation Organization. The volume of air traffic in and out of Taiwan's airports back then cannot be compared with that incredible volume of traffic, millions of planes a year, that come in and out of modern-day Taiwan. Under the visa waiver program, airlines have added even more flights in order to take advantage of greater demand for tourist and business travel from Taiwan into the United States. This number is only going to grow as more and more Taiwanese take advantage of the visa waiver program. It is time that we readmit Taiwan into ICAO so that everyone who boards a plane can have the utmost confidence about the safety of their trip. Aviation technology has progressed by leaps and bounds, and the idea that Taiwan cannot directly communicate with the United States or any other nation engaging in issues regarding air safety is not in anyone's interest. That's not in the interest of any nation. I urge my colleagues to join in supporting H.R. 1151. Taiwan is one of America's closest friends in the world. We share so much in common, including a steadfast dedication to democracy and rule of law and human rights, and it is time that we fixed this problem. So I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back at this time the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back, all time having expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1151? Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker, on that,
gentleman from California.
On that, I would request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.
No, you might have Tom go on, so double support over that.
For purposes, the gentlelady from North Carolina seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 266 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 33, House Resolution 266. Resolved that at any time after the adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill H.R. 1947 to provide for the reform and continuation of agricultural and other programs of the Department of Agriculture through fiscal year 2018 and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Agriculture. After general debate, the Committee of the Whole shall rise without motion. No further consideration of the bill shall be in order except pursuant to a subsequent order of the House. Section 2. Upon the adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order to consider in the House the bill, H.R. 1797, to amend Title 18 United States Code to protect pain-capable unborn children in the District of Columbia and for other purposes. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Judiciary, now printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-15 shall be considered as adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill as amended are waived. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill as amended on any amendment thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one. 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. And 2, 1 motion to recommit with or without instructions.
For purposes, the gentlelady from Maryland seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I raise a point of order against House Resolution 266 because the resolution violates Section 426A of the Congressional Budget Act. The resolution contains a waiver of all points of order against consideration of the bill, H.R. 1797, which includes a waiver of Section 425 of the Congressional Budget Act, which causes a violation of Section 426A.
The gentlewoman from Maryland makes a point of order that the resolution violates Section 426A of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. The gentlewoman has met the threshold burden under the rule, and the gentlewoman from Maryland and a member opposed each will control 10 minutes of debate on the question of consideration. Following debate, the chair will put the question of consideration as the statutory means of disposing of the point of order. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the majority began this Congress, it began with the idea in their language that they would adhere to fiscal responsibility, to constitutionality. In fact, we read the Constitution on the floor of this body, and that they had learned the lessons from the election slaughtering in 2012, and that is to stop the assault on women's health care. But oh no, here we are today with a bill, H.R. 1797, that violates the Congressional Budget Act, that violates the Constitution, that violates the doctor-patient relationship that a woman has with her doctor, and we haven't focused on jobs. And so when you look at H.R. 1797, the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, it would impose a ban across the country on abortion after 20 weeks. Aside from ignoring medical realities and placing the lives of mothers with serious medical conditions at risk through governmental interference with the doctor-patient relationship, the underlying bill also includes reporting requirements that, according to the Congressional Budget Act, which it would violate, would add costs to local law enforcement. And with a total of 25 states introducing 64 similar abortion ban measures in the last 3 years, the bill is yet another assault on women's reproductive rights and is blatantly unconstitutional. Abortion care in this country is a private medical decision that's made between a woman and her health care provider. Those are the only people who should be in the room. And yet here in this legislation, they've created just a narrow exception that doesn't even take into account the risk to a woman's health and would subject physicians to criminal penalties for caring for their patients. H.R. 1797 contains unreasonably unjustified penalties for doctors, including 5 years in jail, and would have a negative impact on abortion care and reproductive health care all across the country. By jeopardizing and criminalizing abortion care, we limit the options women have to receive comprehensive reproductive health care. And these limitations could lead women to access abortion care that is both unsafe and dangerous to their health. I'd like to yield 15 seconds to the other side if they would care to address the question of whether this closed rule means that there will not be a single amendment or alternative offered to this bill, which has a profound effect on women's health and reproductive rights. 15 seconds I'd yield to the gentlewoman from North Carolina if she'd care to answer that question.
Mr. Speaker, this is a dilatory tactic and has nothing to do with UMRA.
Well, reclaiming my time under the rule, it's the case that the bill, I believe, that we'll vote on today for final passage has not followed regular order, and it hasn't been rewritten after its adoption in the Judiciary Committee. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the nation's leading medical experts on women's health, strongly opposes a 20-week ban, citing the threats these laws pose to women's health. And with that, I would like to yield 1 minute to my colleague from California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we're discussing a bill that's divisive, will never become law, and is an affront to women's health. As a longtime advocate for a woman's right to choose and the idea that women and their doctors should be making personal health decisions, not politicians, I stand in strong opposition. This 20-week abortion ban is a harmful measure that jeopardizes a woman's health and her ability to have a family in the future by denying her access to an abortion, even if she experienced severe, dangerous health complications as a result of a pregnancy. In a potentially life-threatening situation, a woman and her doctor deserve to have every medical option available to them. The bill is clearly unconstitutional in an attempt to substitute politicians' judgment for that of doctors and their patients as they make their difficult personal medical decisions. Instead of bringing bills to the floor that address the major issues facing our country right now, the Speaker and Majority Leader have brought another bill to a vote that is much more about political posturing than helping America's economy or students. I ask the leadership of the House, how many jobs does this bill create? Does this help balance our budget? How many student loans will be kept at a low rate by passing this bill? Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentlelady from North Carolina seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to claim time in opposition, point of order, and in favor of consideration of the resolution.
Gentlelady is recognized for 10 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the question before the House is, should the House now consider H.Res. 266? While the resolution waives all points of order against consideration of the bill, the Committee on Rules is not aware of any violation of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. This is a dilatory tactic. In order to allow the House to continue its scheduled business for the day, I urge members to vote yes on the question of consideration of the resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentlelady from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very clear to me that the underlying bill, in fact, does violate the Congressional Budget Act. It imposes a mandate, an unfunded mandate on local police departments for the work that they do. Now, it's this crowd on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Speaker, who's opposed to unfunded mandates. Nevertheless, it's also true that, in fact, the decision to receive an abortion in this country, particularly late in a pregnancy, is an intensely personal decision. And yet it's the suits on the other side of the aisle who've decided that it's their decision to interfere with a woman's right to make those choices between herself and her doctor. It's a decision that none of us want to face, and one that legislators, particularly members of Congress, should not interfere with. The bill also cites the Constitution as its authority in order to qualify under the rules of the House. And yet it is blatantly unconstitutional, completely inconsistent with the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade. And so I'd like to yield 15 seconds again to the gentlewoman from the other side to ask her whether, under the definitions in this bill, what does it mean to not have protection of the life of the mother include psychological or emotional conditions? Well, the gentlewoman can't answer that, and so I suppose I could ask her as well. If the Speaker would allow, I'd yield again 15 seconds to the gentlewoman. If this bill cites the Constitution as its authority in order to qualify under the rules of the House, and yet it's blatantly unconstitutional, do House rules allow it to be considered, allow H.R. 1797 even to be considered on the floor of this House if it's unconstitutional? And I'd yield 15 seconds to the gentlewoman.
Mr. Speaker, I'll repeat what I've said before. This is a dilatory tactic, and we should be moving on to the resolution. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, reclaiming my time, I know that the gentlewoman from North Carolina and the other side would prefer to yield and move on with a bill that violates the Budget Control Act, violates the Constitution, and violates the relationship between a doctor and a patient. And yet the decision to receive an abortion is a woman and a woman's alone. In addition, H.R. 1797 infringes on the right of the District of Columbia to make decisions about the way in which it cares for its residents. I mean, the majority is all over the place, interfering with the District of Columbia, interfering with women's right to make the decision by themselves, and actually stepping on the toes of local law enforcement to impose costs on them to enforce an unconstitutional bill. Thank goodness it won't become law. The sponsor of this bill is certainly entitled to his beliefs, and it was a his because on the Judiciary Committee that considered this, there's not a single Republican woman who had the chance to consider this on the Judiciary Committee, and yet the role of the government should not be to limit access to health care or to limit the freedom and liberties of the public. We should recognize that this decision is one best left to a woman in consultation with her doctor, her family, and her faith. Women across this country don't rely on Congress and politicians to advise them on mammograms, cervical cancer screenings, or maternal health needs, and abortion is no different. As with these other procedures, we should make comprehensive health care available to all women and allow them with the consult of their health provider and loved ones to decide when, how, and why they take care of their health. Americans, including women, sent a clear message last November at the polls. They're tired of Congress meddling in their business and taking extreme and divisive legislation targeted assaulting women's health. And so with that, I actually yield another 15 seconds to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, if she would care to respond whether today, given that 40% of women are primary breadwinners in their household, but women continue to face workplace challenges, pay equity, and other barriers to fully contribute to our economy. Would you agree that this bill does not address those economic challenges for women or create jobs and is an exercise in political theater at best? And with that, I yield 10 seconds to the gentlewoman to respond.
I thank the gentlewoman for asking the question. What I think most Americans would wonder, Mr. Speaker, is where is the due process for the millions of babies who are murdered every year in this country by these unconscionable tactics of abortion? And with that,
reclaiming my time, I'd like to yield 15 seconds to the gentlewoman from Illinois.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Are there any Republican women on the House Judiciary Committee which reported this legislation? And do you think it's fair or proper for a body of men to solely determine one of the most important and private decisions a woman can make in regard to her own health and body? I yield back.
Time's expired. Gentlelady from Maryland.
I'd reserve.
Gentlelady from Maryland reserves. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady from North Carolina reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
From Maryland has 1¼ minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I just have a few questions that I'll just put out there on the table. The American people want us to work to address the nation's most urgent priorities, like creating jobs and strengthening the economy. I wonder if the Speaker at all can inform us what jobs this particular bill creates. Under the new reporting requirements in this bill for rape and incest victims, would they have to report even if their life is in danger from the perpetrator? Curious question. Does this bill disqualify more than half of all rape victims, since 54% of these rape victims do not report rape due to intimidation and embarrassment? Under the definitions in this bill, what does it mean not to have protection of the life of the mother included in psychological and emotional conditions? Does the bill disqualify, again, rape victims? Is it the case that the bill redefines what qualifies as incest by only applying it to a minor? So, if an adult who's been victimized by a relative since childhood and who gets pregnant is not allowed to have an abortion or a pregnancy with that relative, we have a lot of questions. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, I have to tell you, women across America are tired of having their rights assaulted. They're tired of having their health care decisions taken from them. We need to vote down H.R. 1797, and with that I yield.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to allow the House to continue its scheduled business for the day, I urge members to vote yes on the question of consideration of the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. The question is, will the House now consider the resolution? Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The question of consideration is decided in the affirmative. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the purpose of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Slaughter, pending which I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, House Resolution 266 provides for a closed rule providing for consideration of H.R. 1797, the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, and general debate for H.R. 1947, the Federal Agriculture Reform and Risk Management Act. Mr. Speaker, the rule before us today provides for general debate of H.R. 1947, the Federal Agriculture Reform and Risk Management Act, also known as the Farm Bill. This legislation provides for a 5-year authorization of federal agriculture and nutrition policy. H.R. 1947 makes necessary reforms and updates to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, previously known as food stamps, as well as federal agriculture policy. It is important to make common-sense changes to these programs to ensure their viability and that they remain targeted to those most in need of assistance. This year's version of the Farm Bill has gone through regular order, including numerous hearings at the Agriculture Committee, a full committee markup, and amendment process. Additionally, the Rules Committee has received hundreds of amendments from members seeking to further improve the bill during floor consideration. House Republicans remain committed to an open, transparent process, and I am pleased to say we're continuing that commitment with the consideration and process for the Farm Bill. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from North Carolina reserves. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding me the customary 30 minutes and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, for 40 years I've been marching for this Women's Choice Bill, but we seem never to finish with it. It's something that people like to drag up and bring out. In that regard, I want to ask the women of America to think of 2 things. First, I want you to remember the panel that Chairman Issa put together last year to discuss contraception and whether or not women should have access to it. If you recall that panel was made up entirely of men. And there was a young woman, a graduate of law school, who wanted to speak that day, but she was found to be unworthy, unable to speak, and indeed her virtue, her character, everything else about her was assailed because she had tried to do what many of us know we can do here, and that is speak our will. Think about another thing now, to think about the Judiciary Committee. 22, now 23, all white guys, deciding, turning down every amendment to try to preserve women's health, to try to preserve women's psyche, and do anything in the world to do this and to try to discuss that this bill, as my colleague vainly tried to do here, that this is unconstitutional. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows the Senate's not going to take this up. This is purely window dressing. And as I do here often, I want to remind everybody that it costs $24 million a week to run the House of Representatives. We've spent over $54 billion right almost already now just trying to repeal the health care bill. When in the world are we going to get to work? 2.5 weeks from now, the interest rate on college loans will double. Are we doing anything about that? Not a thing on earth. Do we care about the people who are out of work? Do we care about the people who are facing loss of their food stamps? No. We care about war on women. Women of America, keep those two panels before your mind forever. Those are the deciders. The men on ISIS panel, the men on the Judiciary Committee. Now, in state houses all over this country and in governor's mansions and halls of Congress, the majority's anti-choice agenda is driven by men in blue suits and red ties who seem to believe that once they get elected to something, they have the right to play doctor. I would like to think about what they have done over the last years to remind my fellow American women. Already, because of the majority's efforts, women in 8 states are required to undergo an ultrasound before they can exercise the constitutionally protected right to a safe and legal abortion. An ultrasound that is not medically necessary, an ultrasound that is medically contradicted, and an ultrasound for which they are required themselves to pay. As we speak, the legislators in the state of Wisconsin have passed a similar measure through the State House and are awaiting the enactment into law. Most telling is right now more states have a waiting period for abortions than a waiting period to buy a gun. Let me say that again. More states have a waiting period for abortions, a constitutionally protected procedure, than have a waiting period to buy a gun. Now, here in Congress, the majority conducted a hearing at the Oversight and Government Reform Committee last year that I've already spoken of. There were 5 men and 0 women. And as you know, we talked about Sandra Fluke and all the vituperation and hatred that was poured down on her because she wanted to speak. But just last week, I think this past week, the majority took it a whole lot further. For the first time, during the committee, after it was all passed and gone, before it goes to the Rules Committee, the sponsor of this bill made one of those comments like Todd Akin had made, that, and I think if you scratch an awful lot of guys on that committee, they all feel the same way because it keeps coming up over and over. You can't get pregnant, they say, if you're raped. And they believe that to the bottom of their heart, and some of them are doctors. But during the committee amendments to exclude the exceptions for the health of mother and victims of rape and incest, they were rejected along party lines. Now, Mr. Frank has been taken off the bill. And for the first time in my recollection, unanimous consent has to be given here to ask a woman, they have found a Republican woman who will take this bill, off a completely other committee and allow her to manage the bill. Now, if that's not a first, I don't know what. And if that is not PR, I don't know what it is. And if that is not simply trying to fool you, I don't know what else that is. As Mr. Frank's remark and the extreme nature of his bill became clear, they realized they were about to anger the American women, even more than they had last fall. And you know how that turned out at the election. But instead of abandoning the legislation, respecting a woman's right to choose, they decided to try to make changes to the underlying bill after it had already passed the committee and assign a woman outside the committee to manage the bill on the floor. Such a cowardly move is an insult to the intelligence of the women in America. You're supposed to believe this was all done well and properly. No amount of window dressing is going to change the fact that you're severely trying to restrict a woman's right to choose with today's bill, and I don't think anybody makes any bones about that. The majority has argued the legislation is in response to new science, even though if there has ever been a House of Representatives that cared not a whit for science, I can't imagine they would come even close to this one. When a fetus feels pain is the new idea. But as my colleague Mr. Nadler has previously made clear, their so-called new findings, in quotation marks, are nothing more than the marginal views that fly in the face of established science. In fact, one of the experts on which the majority relies has testified that science for and against fetal pain is most uncertain. The fact of the matter is today's legislation is unconstitutional, contains a narrow and inadequate exception for the life of a woman and a victim of rape and incest. And no man on any of those committees, no man on any of those panels is ever going to have to face that problem himself of rape and incest. How strange it is that they know the precise answer for people who are victimized by it. Now, many serious health conditions actually materialize or worsen after the 20-week mark in a pregnancy and can seriously compromise the health of the mother. A physician has to be able to provide the best care for their patients, and in case a woman's health is exacerbated by the pregnancy, the politicians have no right in intruding on a doctor-patient relationship and criminalizing those trying to protect their patients' lives and safety. Furthermore, the majority's requirement that a victim of rape or incest report the crime to authorities before receiving an abortion effectively prevents many victims from exercising the right to choose. More than half of all rape victims, as we know, don't report, and that's a sad thing. But the requirement in today's bill ensures a woman who's been a victim of rape or incest faces massive barriers to exercising her right to safe and legal productive health care. Mr. Speaker, from requiring women to undergo mandatory ultrasounds to applying police reporting requirements for victims of rape, the majority has made it very clear that they don't trust women. In fact, it came up at the Judiciary Committee that one of the reasons they needed to report it to police because women would lie. I think they make an exception in that case for their sisters, their daughters, their mothers, perhaps. It's just the rest of us who can't be trusted. Try as he might, no man will ever understand the choice that faces a young woman who is told that she suffers from severe valvular heart disease and that if she carries a child to term, her life and the life of that child are at risk. Or the choice of a woman who is violently raped and would be reminded of the crime against her every moment of every day if she is forced to carry the pregnancy to term. I urge my colleagues to respect the established science on this issue and the constitutional right of every American woman. Reject today's rule and the underlying legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New York reserves. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suspect that my colleague from New York knows this, but I will make sure it gets into the record. In the 2007 case of Gonzalez versus Carhart, the Supreme Court made clear that there is a, quote, legitimate interest of the government in protecting the life of the fetus that may become a child, end quote. The Supreme Court has also made clear that, quote, the government may use its voice and its regulatory authority to show its profound respect for the life within the woman, end quote, and that Congress may show such respect for the unborn through, quote, specific regulation because it implicates additional ethical and moral concerns that justify a special prohibition. Mr. Speaker, I'm really troubled by the fact that so many of my colleagues simply refuse to acknowledge that we're dealing with human life in this situation, in the situation of abortion. My heart goes out to any woman who is facing a situation where they're considering abortion. I think every member of our conference feels that way, men and women. Nobody takes the issue of abortion lightly, but unfortunately not enough attention is being paid to the unborn child. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield now 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Congressman Fleming.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 3 minutes.
I want to thank the gentlelady and all the great work she's done, gentlelady from North Carolina, for all of her work on this. I rise today, Mr. Speaker, to support the rule and the underlying bill, the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, that is so vital. My background, I'm a physician who has delivered hundreds of babies during my career. In addition to that, I'm a husband of 35 years, a father of 4, 2 boys, 2 girls, grandfather of 2 boys, and soon, in 6 weeks, grandfather of a little girl, a little granddaughter, and I'm so proud. Let me tell you a moment about what I witnessed. About the time of the 20 weeks, midterm, the ultrasound, the 4D ultrasound now, gives such an amazing view into the window of that womb. And what did I see? I could see that that little girl looks just like her big brother. Number 2, in another frame, she's sucking her thumb. And then in another frame, she's holding up 2 fingers as though to say, be patient, I'll be out soon. We have such wonderful technology that today we can actually do surgery on a fetus at 20 weeks in order to fix a heart ailment or some other condition that may kill the baby in the womb or soon thereafter. Well, what have we learned from this technology? We've learned that they feel pain. We have to provide anesthesia. Now, Mr. Speaker, our friends on the other side of the aisle, when it comes to animals, they're all about the Humane Society and humane treatment of animals. And I have high regard for that. When it comes to the issue of torture or even discomfort for prisoners of war, they're all about supporting that. But what happens in a midterm or later pregnancy when there's an abortion? What happens is just absolute torture. You realize that in Washington, D.C. today, a woman can go for an abortion while she is in labor at term. And how would you do the abortion? How is it done? How did Dr. Gosnell do it? Stick a trocar into the skull, suck the brain out, dismember the baby limb from limb, literally. What torture and what pain? Is that really the kind of people that we are, Mr. Speaker? I think not. So we have understood that at least at 20 weeks, maybe sooner, the baby feels pain. And so I would just submit to you today, Mr. Speaker, that this bill is not just about abortion. This is about pain. It's about torture to that young life. And we can't say that this is like an amputation of a limb. That baby inside the womb has a distinct DNA that you'll never see again, either in history or in the future. It is a different human being that's living there inside of its mother. So I yield my time back, and I thank the gentlelady, and I am in support of this bill.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Mr. Lauro.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 2 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this rule and the blatantly unconstitutional underlying legislation, which threatens the health and basic rights of women all over America. Right now, we should be working to create jobs and grow the economy. Instead, here we are again with the majority trying to insert their extreme and divisive ideological preferences into law. And yet again, they are trying to impose their traditional view of a woman's role on everyone else, force women back into these traditional roles with limited opportunities. This legislation, which attempts to ban virtually all abortions after 20 weeks, is a clear violation of the law of the land and has already been struck down in its sponsor's home state of Arizona. But they don't give much regard for law of the land. Witness the number of times that they have voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act, 37 times. This bill is anti-choice, anti-constitution, anti-science, and it is, yes, anti-women. There is no exception in this bill for women whose health is threatened by carrying the fetus to term. Yes, why should we worry about women's health or whether they live or whether they die? Instead, this bill puts the federal government squarely between a woman and her doctor. It threatens doctors with 5 years in jail if they perform a legal, constitutional, and sometimes medically necessary procedure. I asked my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, does the bill disqualify more than half of all rape victims, since 54% of these victims do not report a rape due to intimidation or embarrassment? Or, under the new reporting requirements in this bill for rape and incest victims, would they have to report even if their life is in danger from the perpetrator? And yes, is it the case that this bill redefines what qualifies as incest by only applying it to a minor? Therefore, an adult who has been victimized by a relative since childhood and who gets pregnant is not allowed to have an an abortion of pregnancy with that relative. Simply put, this proposed ban is antithetical to our laws. It's an affront to women's health, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Bridenstine.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act. In a report commissioned by the Department of Justice, Dr. Anand, a fetal pain expert, wrote, "It is my opinion that the human fetus possesses the ability to experience pain from 20 weeks of gestation, and the pain perceived by the fetus is possibly more intense than that perceived by term newborns or older children," unquote. The reality of Dr. Anand's statement is seen in the fact that surgeons routinely administer anesthesia to unborn children before performing neonatal surgery. The truth is that at 20 weeks, these unborn children feel every bit of pain inflicted on them in the name of choice and in the name of convenience. Mr. Speaker, what we do with this knowledge says a lot about us. If we turn a blind eye to the agony and suffering of our most vulnerable, can we say that we are still a nation who pursues life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? If we willingly embrace cruelty in the name of choice, then can we say with integrity that we continue to secure the blessings of liberty not only for ourselves, but for our posterity? The good news is that for those who have been affected by the pain of abortion, there is one who chose, who made a real choice to endure pain on behalf of all of us, and by his stripes we are healed. Mr. Speaker, as members of Congress, let us remember that even though we may not be able to hear their cries, we are not absolved from the guilt of ignoring their pain. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, let me just thank the gentlelady for yielding, but more importantly, I just want to thank Congresswoman Slaughter, our ranking member on the Rules Committee, for fighting for women's health and the rights of women really all of your life. Thank you so much. I rise in strong opposition to this rule and the underlying bill. Once again, Republicans have decided to make women's health a battleground as part of their, yes, ongoing war on women. The bill on the floor this week is nothing more than a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade and a vehicle for yet another ideological attack against women's reproductive rights. In fact, this is the 10th time that the Republicans have forced a vote on this topic since taking control of the House in 2011. The bill is a direct threat to the privacy rights and health of every woman living in this country, and especially women of color who already face increased stigma and other barriers to reproductive health due to the terrible Hyde Amendment. Now, I remember the days of back alley abortions. Many women died and were permanently injured before Roe v. Wade. With this bill, Republicans have decided to try to take us back there, to threaten physicians, for instance, with a criminal prosecution. Can you imagine a criminal prosecution for attempting to provide the medically accurate information and care that is best for their patients? Why in the world should members of Congress or any legislator interfere with women's personal health choices? These private decisions should always be between a woman, her family, her doctor, or whoever else she chooses to help make these very difficult decisions. We should not be making it, not you nor me. We should let women make their own decisions. Congress has no business in the personal lives of women, no business. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this rule, and let's get back. May I have an additional 10 seconds?
I yield the gentlelady an additional 10 seconds.
Thank you very much. As I was saying, we need to vote no on this rule and this bill. We need to get back to the real business, like creating jobs that we should be doing, like creating economic opportunities we should be doing. We should be trying to figure out how to reduce poverty. We should try to figure out how to ensure our young people have the best quality public education. There are many issues this Congress needs to take on. Why don't you stay out of the personal lives of women? That has no place on this floor.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. contrary to what our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are accusing us of, we're talking about the beginning of the 6th month of pregnancy. Nothing in this bill has any impact on abortion during the first 20 weeks. With that, Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to my distinguished colleague from Montana, Mr. Daines.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, as a person of conscience, I believe we are called to protect the most vulnerable in our society. The Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act is an important measure to do exactly that: protect unborn children who can feel pain. And as parents of 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, Cindy and I instinctively do all we can as parents to protect our children from pain. During the Gosnell trial, we all learned of the gruesome methods of ending the life of just-born children, some of whom were a little over 20 weeks old. If Gosnell aborted these children moments before they are removed from the womb, in the method similar to the dismemberment which occurs in several clinics throughout our country, and science tells us causes pain to the baby, would the loss of life have been any less tragic, any less appalling? We cannot stand idly by and allow such painful terminations of human life to continue. I urge passage of this bill, and I look forward to casting my vote in support of the rule, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York.